Thank you. Welcome everybody. Discussion. Mapsididari shish. Huni dog shish. Midase Kim Mettler. Ehedode. I said in my language, hello, welcome. It's good to see you. My name is Kim Mettler. I am the Next Generations Director for the Association on American Indian Affairs, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today. And I'm going to turn it over to my co-panelists here and have them each introduce themselves, starting with Chantel.
Thanks, Kim. My name is Chantel Cloud, and I am a tribal court collaboration specialist with TLPI, and I've been working with TLPI for about 2 years now. And I also am a member of the Southern Ute Indian tribe from southwestern Colorado. And I also kind of like to give a brief history of my prior work as well, because I've spent about 30 years in the field of probation and working with juveniles and adults in different capacities in different states and different counties. And I've also worked in the education field as well. And I've also done some co-coordination with the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative as well. And so that's just a little bit about my background. But I can say that I love what I do. I love working with people. I love working with tribes. And really, what I'm doing with TLPI is working with the tribal courts and tribal justice systems to really enhance programming and strengthen the sovereignty of tribes through their tribal courts. And I will pass it on to Annie.
Hi, everyone. My name's Annie Brokenleg. I am currently the state juvenile diversion coordinator slash JDAI coordinator for the state of South Dakota. I've been in this role for 8 years, but it is coming to an end. My last day in this position is Friday. So this is a good way to end doing this webinar because I think some of the most exciting, most impactful work that I've done in that last 8 years is working with Tamera Marshall, who's also our panelist, and our tribal committee here in South Dakota to increase collaboration between tribal and state jurisdictions and increase diversion opportunities for our tribal youth in South Dakota. So I'm really happy to be here today talking about some of the things we've been able to do in South Dakota. But it is bittersweet as I'm leaving the state of South Dakota here in a week from today. So Tamera, I know you're a little under the weather, but it's always good to see you. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tamera Marshall. I'm the Youth Diversion Coordinator for OST in Bennett County. I've been doing this for about 3 years now. We're in year 4. And I am a member of the Oglala Sioux tribe. I live on a Pine Ridge Reservation in Oglala. I used to live in Rapid and commute back and forth every day, but I decided to move down here about 2 years ago now, and to be closer to the community and the shorter drive. So, yeah, so that's me.
It's nice to see you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to Annie and Chantel for joining us today. And thank you everybody for joining our webinar. Um, so why we're here today is because we want what's best for Native youth, and Native youth are treated a little differently by the justice system than others, and I'll give you a couple of examples. Native youth are 4 times likely to be detained or incarcerated than their white counterparts. They're less likely to have their cases diverted or to receive probation. And while youth incarceration has dropped by 75% over the last 25 years, Native youth are still overrepresented in the youth justice system. There are a lot of things that make Native youth and Native youth experience in justice systems unique, and that is partly in due to their relationship with Native nations. And there's a federal law called the Indian Child Welfare Act, otherwise known as ICWA, that applies in certain cases if there's a status offense where any part of the proceeding results in the need for that youth to be placed out of home. ICWA would require you to work with the Native Nation. But how do you get to work with the Native Nation? How do you know that you're supposed to? Well, that comes down to you first have to identify whether or not the youth that you're working with is a Native youth. Are they a citizen of a Native nation or are they eligible for citizenship? And the only way you're going to know that is by asking. And so our position at the association and my program, what we advocate strongly for is that every youth that you come into contact with at the earliest point possible, you should be making inquiry as to whether or not that young person has a connection to a Native nation. And then the second part of that is if they do have a connection to a Native nation, you then want to engage that nation for collaboration and partnership. And it could be something as simple as verifying citizenship for that young person, but it also could be working with that nation to ensure that culturally grounded interventions are included in whatever the plan is for that young person. So a lot of times there seems to be some resistance or there seems to be misinformation out there about why you should work with Native nations. A lot of times it's not even a thought for folks that they should be doing outreach and engaging in these relationships, but collaboration with Native nations is really, really important. It's important because, as I explained with ICWA, it's required as a matter of law. And in cases where ICWA doesn't apply, we still advocate that ICWA is best practice. Native nations can assist in identifying Native youth. They can help navigate a very complex legal landscape. Native youth potentially are subject to 3 different jurisdictions. And so Native nations have that expertise in managing that. Partnerships with Native nations could mean increased increased access to things like medical or dental services or mental health services. And as I said, culturally grounded services should always be included in tailored interventions with Native youth, primarily because research shows that a strong and positive Native identity is a protective factor for Native youth, and it helps contribute to improved outcomes for them. So that's why we're here. And I just want to mention that I've dropped into the chat the website for the Association on American Indian Affairs, and specifically where you'll find information about the Next Generations program, my program. And I also dropped a link in the chat for the guide that is a sibling to our conversation today. And the guide is called Strengthening the Circle, Collaborating with Native Nations to Support Native Youth. So the information that we're talking about today, I think is a really good sibling to the guide. And the guide contains a lot of information and really practical tips and information to help guide and to help you engage in those relationships and collaboration. So that's also available on our website. So I'm going to turn it over now to Chantel and Annie and Tamera. And I'm going to just ask if you could talk a little bit about models of collaboration. Like when you think of collaborating and who you've worked with, who were some of the partners that you worked with? How did it go? What were some of the challenges that you had to deal with? What were the successes? And also, what advice would you give folks who are looking to collaborate with Native nations?
I can go. So I also forgot to mention in my introduction that I worked for my own tribe, and I started out as a case manager and a probation officer for our juvenile and adult healing to wellness courts. And then I became the chief judge. And our tribe, we do civil and criminal cases, and I also oversaw our healing and wellness courts. And so I feel like that's really important to mention because you have different perspectives when you work for your tribe as a tribal member, but you also get a different perspective when you're working with counties or state or federal agencies that are outside of the tribe. And so I feel like I've had a lot of collaborative experience on both ends. And, I always say that the first collaborative partner is always the client. And it's really important to realize that. So when we're working with juveniles, that juvenile is my first client that I'm collaborating with. That's my partner. And without that partner, none of the rest is going to, work or do anything else. And so I think that is where we begin building that trust that we talk about that also then, goes into working with tribes, right? Because if you're not a tribal member or you're not already working for that tribe and you're trying to collaborate, you have to build that trust relationship and start understanding, who it is you're working with. What are their goals? What is the why, of why we're even doing this work? And for me, the why is helping that client overcome whatever the issues are that got them to the judicial system to begin with. And so in all the years that I've worked, I know that there's a lot of trauma. And for Native people, there's historical trauma, there's generational trauma. There's a lot of compounded trauma that we deal with, but I think that goes for a lot of people in the judicial system as well. And so what we're really trying to do is help them to heal and to address those underlying issues so that they don't come back through the judicial system. And it's not a revolving door. And, that's a term that we hear a lot. We see people come back and forth all the time. And so it's really about working with them to understand what got them there to begin with and start working on repairing those things or restoring those issues, if you will, and restoring relationships. And so that's where I begin. And then from there, I say, okay, who do we need to bring in? And I start next with family or friends or other supports that are going to be a natural support system for them once they leave my office or leave the court, because you want to leave them with support that's going to help them ongoing. And so you bring those people in as your partners as well so that they can be there throughout the whole process. And a lot of times they have additional insight that you might not have as a professional. And they may have additional information or additional history that can help you then say, okay, these are other partners that we can bring in. So of course you have professionals, like you may have mental health providers, substance abuse providers, education partners. In my tribe, and even in probation, I look at social services. So is there a social services need, or are they already involved somehow? So they have to be at the table as well. And then maybe there's, voc rehab or the Boys and Girls Club or equine therapy or, therapeutic art agencies. So really looking at the community and even at the state and finding what resources are available to then come in and really support that client and their family so that they can get through this process, not just check boxes. That's something that I'm like, that's never what we want to do. We're not just checking boxes. We're really trying to work holistically with our clients to really give them wraparound services to really address those needs. And then you're looking at state partners as well, or county partners. So sometimes our clients may have, other cases going on in other jurisdictions. They may be looking at, okay, now they're going to be maybe put in a detention facility. So that facility then becomes your partner too. And like I said, I had a specialized caseload where I supervised juveniles who had been in out-of-home placements and were in residential facilities. So then I had to then work with those people to make sure that the needs were being met of my juvenile education, dental, vision, medical, all of those needs, as well as making sure they had contact with their family, that they were getting the counseling that they needed, and not just the juvenile, but the family also, because you're preparing for them to go home and you want to make sure that those things are already in place and that you're planning that strategy for them to go home and be able to be successful. So that's kind of just in a nutshell some of the partners that I've worked with collaboratively. But again, ultimately for me, it starts with the client. It starts with that juvenile that we're working with. And in Native nations, it's really also looking at, do they even have a connection with their tribe or their culture? And then how do we start bringing those pieces in as well? Because those are going to be the other piece. And one of the things I love about working with tribes is that we look at those things. It's not just from the neck up, but we're also looking at their spirit, their soul, their emotions, trying to get them out of that constant fight or flight mode and bringing them back to safety. And that kind of begins in grounding them in who they are as a person. And a lot of times I see that people who are in the judicial system have somehow gotten a bit of a broken spirit, and that's where there's drug use and all those other types of things that they kind of come in and start self-medicating, and then helping them move back to really learning who they are in those ways, I think is really important. And so I'll save the rest of the questions for a little bit, and I'll just turn it over to Tamara and Annie and give them some time to add to that.
Thank you, Chantel. Tamara, if you want, I can kind of start in talking about collaboration and how we got started at the state level. And then you could probably speak to then like locally how that collaboration works
Yep.
with, does that sound good?
Yeah.
So Kim, in your introduction, you talked about some statistics on how Native youth are overrepresented, and Tamara and I have presented a lot of different places about this state tribal collaboration that we've been able to implement in South Dakota, where we created the first ever state tribal youth diversion program in South Dakota, where the state actually diverts kids to the tribe. And that's what Tamara runs, which is really cool. But it took a lot of collaboration to get there. And the first thing, though, that Tamara and I like to say, and I really feel like I can say it now that I'm leaving in 3 days, right, is that South Dakota, and I'm sure it's definitely not the gold standard, right, in collaboration between the state and the tribes. And have things gotten a little better? Maybe, right? But what we are speaking to is specifically the tribal committee that Tamara sits on and 8 other of our tribal stakeholders across South Dakota. And my job with UJS under the judicial branch is to simply staff and coordinate that group. As a white woman that is an employee of the state government, we felt that we would have the most impact with our tribes if if the stakeholders on that committee were tribal members themselves. And I think even with me leaving, and we just had a meeting at our state capitol where all of our stakeholders came. And talked about the importance of continuing that tribal stakeholder group and the importance of keeping it tribal members. And so I will just start there, right? Because I think that we've been able to accomplish a lot. We can speak to that a little bit. Kim, the data that you mentioned, unfortunately in South Dakota, we and this is the best year that we've had in terms of the disparities. 41%, and I just pulled these numbers this morning. So far this year, 41% of the youth referred to a detention center in South Dakota were Native American or identified as Native, not necessarily enrolled, but identified as Native. They make up 12% of the population. white youth made up 43%. So Native youth are the bulk of the kids getting referred to detention in South Dakota. Those numbers every year that I've been looking in my 8 years are close to 50%. So I was excited to see it's down. It's still horrendous, right? But it is exciting to see that that potentially some of the work our tribal work group is doing is having an impact. And so collaboration, what did that mean, right? It meant the formation of this tribal, we call ourselves the Tribal JDAI Committee. We're a subcommittee of our state JDAI committee. And really what we're looking at is how we can offer alternatives to detention, diversion options for tribal youth, and for kids that are living off reservation, but maybe in an area that's checkerboarded, or like the area that Tamera works in is their kids that are in a state county that's but 100% of the kids coming into the system were Native because of the jurisdictional issues, right? And before Tamera, those kids were there was no diversion option. Those kids were going into a courthouse. I've been to that courthouse. Tamara can speak to that. It's like the Wild West out there. And going into this courthouse with a judge and being placed on probation with a white probation officer that's not from that area, that has no concept of the amazing cultural resources that exist on the reservation. And to no surprise, those kids then fell deeper into the system, right? And so what this started with was, and this was pre-Tamra, a group of tribal stakeholders that cared. And it was, I mean, I had been doing some work as a state JDAI coordinator, and so I'll talk a little bit as a white person if you're on this webinar, and what can you do as a Wishichu, which is white person in Lakota. What can you do? Spend the time building relationships and showing up and doing what you say you're going to do. Because there's a lot of mistrust in Native communities, and rightfully so, especially in the state of South Dakota. So you really have to, walk the walk, I guess, right? And show up. And, when you say you're going to get resources, i.e., financial resources, I mean, that was like, hey, we have these ideas that we want to bring a diversion program to you, Oglala Sioux Tribe, and to Bennett County, knowing that resources are scarce. Where's the financial backing behind that? So going in with like, hey, there's some grant opportunities we can offer, and making that grant opportunity as easy as possible, right? And so, trying to cut down the red tape. We did have to get a memorandum of understanding between the tribe and the county. And if that can happen with Bennett County and the Oglala Sioux Tribe, I feel like it can happen anywhere, right, Tamara? Um, so those memorandums of understanding, and the way we did that was, I think what a lot of people that do in youth justice do, which is we all want what's best for kids. And the research shows us what's best for kids is keeping them out of the justice system, right, as much as we possibly can. So offering those diversion programs and opportunities up front. Kim, you did an excellent job of articulating the importance of cultural programming for Native youth and how that ties to identity. So talking about the research behind that, and that's really what sold. And that state's attorney, Sarah Harris, gets a lot of credit in Bennett County for being open to this, to giving that up a little, right? That's hard for prosecutors sometimes, but to say, yes, I trust you, Tamara, I trust your program to hold these kids accountable, because that's what, prosecutors are, and that's important, right? But doing it in a way that is culturally responsive and something that kids can identify with. And so now what our group does, because we have Tamara and we have a healing to wellness court with our Crow Creek Nation, we're trying to highlight that for our other tribal nations in South Dakota and model what that could look like. It's obviously not going to be the same everywhere, right? But and then the other goal of that group is to exactly what this webinar is about, is to get state stakeholders, law enforcement. We had a whole conference on law enforcement and state and tribal law enforcement to come together to talk about how they can work across jurisdictions, know what resources are out there. That's really important. So that's a lot. Tamara, anything you want to add about collaboration with our group or locally?
I think I would just add on here that um, in order to start this, you guys had outside resources, like y'all met at different, like at in Rapid City at Eric Brinks White, I Am Legacy training, and just have that motivation that we all, like you said, we all want the same thing for our youth. And I just like to stress that meeting face to face with all your stakeholders is really important. It's harder for them to say no, but it's also just a good way to build that um, communication with them and get to know them.
Mhm.
And I think whatever I came on, um, it was kind of already established. So all I had to do was they just threw me in a front seat and said, "Go."
All
So
you
I
had to
went.
do, all
All
you
you
had,
have to
yeah.
do, right?
Tamara, you built that program.
Kim, I'd like to add also that one of the things that's really important with collaboration, like I said, in our tribal court, we had state buy-in, we had federal buy-in, and part of that is because we would continually invite those people to the table. And you have to have a voice, you have to have a champion, you have to have somebody that's not afraid to speak up and say, hey, we're missing these people that should be at the table or should be a part of our stakeholder meetings, or whatever it might be. But being able to be the person that outreaches and invites others to come, that was something that I really sought out, because I was like, this is something that we're doing well, but we also need to have other partnerships with people that also are champions for our youth and families as well. And really trying to find those people, to then have those people kind of bring in other people that they may know is really important as well, as far as collaboration with your programming and being able to have sustainability. And then in terms of collaboration, of course, the informal and formal processes, like Annie was speaking about, having those MOUs in place also helps have sustainability in your programming, because people change, people move, just like Annie's leaving her position. We have that happen within tribes also. And so having something in writing is important. And then even within our tribe, we had it put in our code, that this is a process that the tribe is feeling is important in working with our youth and our families. And so that also strengthens the ability to collaborate, because it's going to then be long term. Like whoever's sitting in the council chair, is going to know that this is something that's within our tribal code, and that's something that our, tribal ancestors, and forefathers were like, yes, this is something that we need to continue to do. And then, of course, your policies and procedures are always important as well, and continuing to revisit those so that you're improving them as you go along. And one of the things that we did, like Annie was mentioning, our tribal code didn't include diversion. And so we had to get creative and create a way of having something that was similar to that, that allowed the prosecutor to say, okay, this juvenile can participate in this program. And if they're successful, then we, can dismiss their case or whatever it might be, and able to kind of keep them out of the system. But being able to give them the resources that they needed to be successful as well. So that's just something that I wanted to add to that part of the collaborative initial discussion there. But I think with our, we saw a need that wasn't being met by traditional justice. And so, our chief judge that came before me said, we need to do something that's more restorative and traditional and cultural. And that's kind of how that Healing to Wellness Court came into being. And now they have a family healing to wellness court as well. And so it's really expanding. And I think that's important to consider as well.
Thank you. Um, a couple things that I heard that I want to just call forward is one thing that I was thinking about in terms of building these collaborations is what I heard really from all of you is it's not just about how you come together in a singular instance. You have a youth that you need to address their issues so everybody comes together. It is really about building those relationships outside of those singular cases. It is about really building relationship for the long term. And that does definitely take time. And I think if I have background with child welfare, which follows very much these same tracks that we're talking about now. One of the lessons there is you want to start working on those relationships before you need them. So, wherever you are joining us today, if you're not working with Native nations, if you know that you have Native youth, then you want to start thinking about how to do this outreach and how to introduce yourself and how to do this engagement because it's really difficult to try to build this kind of trust primarily. Trust is the foundation for the success, and it's really hard to build that when you're responding and reacting to a crisis situation or something that needs your immediate attention. The other thing that I heard is I think it was Annie who was talking about this isn't about checking boxes, right? And I think this is something important to consider is that, when we're thinking about justice reform, how are we doing things different to uplift our youth? We have to shift our mindset about our approach. And I talk about this with child welfare folks. It's like if you're going through this process with the idea that I have a checklist of things that I have to do to manage this case and to move this through the process, that's very transactional. But if you're really interested in how can we move this young person beyond where they're at now? And how can we help them set them up for success instead of let's just get them out of here now, or assuming that they're not able to be successful. If we have an eye towards real healing and real support for that young person, we need to really approach it from a transformational mindset. And I think that requires you have to be willing to listen very deeply and to really be humble and bring the humility to these spaces. You really have to think about how you may be accustomed to showing up as the authority with the authority, but when you're collaborating with Native nations, there's a whole other expertise and experience that exists. And it really is transformational when you can figure out a way to take a step back and allow the leadership to come from the nations. And the other part of it too is just if you're willing to step outside of the way you've always done things, if you're willing to try something that maybe you don't understand or feels a little uncomfortable to approach, that's where these reform and that's where this change can really take place. So we have about 20 minutes left in our webinar, and I just want to ask if, there's been lots of advice, but I was just wondering, If you had just a singular piece of advice that you could give people about how best to work with Native youth and Native nations, what would that be? And also, while you're considering that, I'm just going to say, any of the webinar participants, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we will get to those before we wrap up today.
I would say for me, and this is kind of like I kind of said at the beginning, but this is how I've operated in most of the years that I've worked with people. And it's that we're in partnership. And I tell this to my client, that we're working together. Yeah, I may have a job where maybe I have to hold you accountable for certain things, but really it's about helping you to be successful. And I need you to help me do that. And so, really like what you had just said about being humble, about not saying, I know everything and you need to do it the way that I tell you to do it. It's like, no, you're the expert on your own life. And so I need you to really kind of tell me, what has worked for you, what hasn't worked for you, and what are your goals, and how can I assist you in getting there? And so it really is looking at it from that partnership lens, and even I think if we look at our own relationship, so it's like the most successful relationships are where you're valued, respected, where you feel seen and heard and understood, as well as being supported and encouraged. And that's really kind of what it is, looking at it from that level of it really is a more humanistic and more compassionate way of working with people, as opposed to I'm going to let my biases lead the way. And a lot of time that shuts doors before we even get started. And so, I tell people you have to love your clients. And they look at me like I'm crazy, but I'm like, no, you really have to love the people that you work with. And it's not like you don't even have to like them, but if you're loving somebody,
Yeah.
it's caring enough to see that they do well. And even sometimes caring enough when they don't do well and they're not successful, but knowing that there is a person that's sitting across from them who cared enough with, or about them to work with them. Because I've had hard conversations and I've had to recommend people go to jail. I've had to put people in jail as a judge, but they knew that it wasn't done from a place of malice or whatever, and they were able to take it and say, you know what, you're right, because I didn't do what I needed to do, or I made decisions that led me to that, area where I'm now having to go spend some time in jail. But then they come back and say, you know what, thank you, because you cared enough about me to be honest with me. And I think that's part of it too, is being authentic. People know when you're not authentic, and they just, and especially with tribes, because I even know, it's like they know when you're BSing them or whatever, and you don't ever want to go there. So you have to really check yourself and make sure that you're coming from a place of, being authentic and really caring about what that outcome is going to be, and being a true partnership. So that would be my advice in a long-winded way.
Excellent advice. Thank you, Chantel.
I would kind of go off of what you said, Kim, because you said it in such a the like the understanding of tribal sovereignty and going in with humility when you're meeting with tribes and understanding that you're not the authority, right? When you're going into a tribal nation, that they have sovereignty for a reason. And Tamara, I think, when we were looking at, I mean, I'm looking at my like lessons learned thing, like one of the things, I had spent, years working across the state, helping state, county jurisdictions build up diversion programs. So I thought, well, it'll be the same, right? No, it's not the same because there's tribal code and all like, and so, Tamara says all she did is just, get in the driver's seat. Not true at all. She's done all sorts of things to make that program to what it is today. So, but one of those was, hey, Tamara, here, this is what diversion it looks like everywhere else. Well, she realized that didn't quite work that way, and that um, they had their own way of how they were going to divert cases and all of that. So just respecting that. I think someone asked like how it's something about a tribal juvenile court. I mean, that's the thing, right? If the tribes are going to have their own courts, right? If that's, in their nation and that's with their structure, they're going to have their own way of handling youth cases, and it's not for the state or anyone to tell them what to do. We approached it as, hey, here's an option to keep kids out of the system, or here's what an alternative to detention could look like. Like give them the resources, not at all approaching and telling them how to do it, I guess would be my advice.
Excellent advice. Thank you. Tamara, do you have any advice you'd like to? I'm sure you have some advice.
Yeah. Um, I turned my camera off. Today I'm a little bit under the weather, so it's like um, but my advice would be to be patient, determined, and compassionate. It took me uh, 3 years to get into our own tribal court. Um, since the first start, when we first started, they weren't quite as receptive to our program, what we was trying to do with our youth, for our youth, and just persistent, just kept trying to get it. We talked to our council members, we showed them our codes, we just kept meeting with different council members, the vice president, and we finally, this year, the end of our third year, we were finally accepted into the courthouse, and they were giving us more referrals. So I think it just takes a lot of trust um, and just keep talking to them and letting them know your plan and what you want to accomplish out of it, and just keep being persistent. Um, yeah. And
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
oh no, I doesn't say that's probably the bottom line is just keep being persistent.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate what all of you said. I know, in my experience, it's the same child welfare, right? You're building relationships. And I think I would offer too for folks outside of Indian country to remember, like, you're dealing with people who've lived through a particular history. Like there is this trauma. The policies of the United States have been intended to harm us and get rid of us, and yet here we stand. And virtually every encounter that we've had with government, with government or representatives of government, have cost us something very precious. And so it doesn't matter how well intended you may be in developing this relationship, you have to overcome that. And it's not easy, but as they were talking about, like, the authenticity, come honestly with integrity and authenticity, be patient, don't, and be compassionate, and have that humility. That's kind of how you show up in this role, to build that capacity and to develop those relationships. And I would also add, to understand, not to add more pressure to the situation, but to understand that there's people that have come before you, and if things are going really good and there's a great relationship, you need to understand that every decision you make and how you behave and how you engage, you are responsible, not just for you're responsible for the relationship of those that have come before you, and you're responsible for the people who come after. And so you have to be really keenly aware of how you act, what you say, and what you do in any given moment can blow things all up, or it can really solidify and hunker things down and all things in between. It's really important to understand your impact in that regard. Um, I want to shift to, we have a couple questions here in the chat, and I'm going to start with Linda's question. She says, here in Maine, we started funding cultural engagement mentors for each of the 5 tribes here. We funded them for 3 years, and next year they have a 5-year SAMHSA grant to continue this program. And we've noticed a decline in referrals from local PD and school of the tribal youth. That being said, how difficult is it to start a tribal juvenile court?
I think Annie answered that pretty well, and I think it really depends on the tribe and the capacity of the tribe. And so it may start off small as a program and not a completely different court, and it may be a docket. And a lot of times that's easier for smaller tribes is to do a docket and we do that with our healing and wellness court. That is a specific day and time during the month or week, depending on how many youth you have, and just set aside, that specific closed hearing or whatever it might be to hear those kinds of cases. But have, again, those stakeholders involved, because like I said, you have education department, you have all these other agencies that may be working with that youth. And so it may be important to have those MOUs in place. And it could be, starting off as a juvenile healing and wellness court program, and where you have the ability to have that holistic approach that's culturally relevant, and you have that ability to bring in those people, into the hearings and things like that, so that youth has that support. So that might be a consideration, is to start off small and then to kind of build from that as well. And then, not to assume anything, but with the decline in referrals, make sure you're asking those questions of, what is changing? Is it the dynamic? Is it the youth? Is it that we're doing the same thing over and over again? Or, because sometimes maybe the passion of the people that are doing the work is declining, or maybe there's been some change in circumstance. And so getting that feedback is really important, because maybe there needs to be a change in how things are doing, or, who's doing the mentoring as well, because there's a lot of things that could impact that. And so having those conversations is really important, because that can also help guide you to be doing some new and innovative programming, or, bringing other people in that might be more, dynamic, if that is what is needed, because youth have a lot of energy. So you got to be kind of talking to them as well. Again, like I said, they're kind of the experts on what's happening or not happening. And so that's where your partnership with them, comes in, because they may say to the PD, I don't want to do that program. I'm not interested in that. And so having those questions asked is really important.
Thank you, Chantel. Allison says, I love the partnership aspect that Chantel, you were emphasizing earlier. How do you involve families in this partnership with youth? Excellent question.
Yeah, well, that really is one of those things, again, of asking them what their why is. What is it they want? What is their goals for their family? And a lot of times there's issues within the family, right? The adults, you don't just have a juvenile that kind of out of, sometimes you do, but not always. So there may be issues within the family that, they need support. And so having those conversations of how can we support you to support your youth, and being, again, sincere about that, and getting them involved in programs and services. There may be financial needs, like Annie had mentioned earlier. There may be housing, there may be substance or counseling needs, or, there may be a whole lot of different things that they need assistance with as well. And so you kind of really have to start saying, we're going to help you, because this is a family affair. You can't just work with the juvenile. They're not going to be able to just take care of themselves and go do whatever. Some cases maybe they're old enough to, kind of go in a different direction. And I've worked with youth in that, where they were, not going to go back to their home because of too many circumstances. And so they were put in different programs where they could learn how to, get a job and do all these different types of things. But really, if the goal is for them to go back to a healthy home or be part of a healthy home, you have to have those conversations with their family. And again, it may be a mom and grandma or, whoever it is. So you're really looking also to the extended family, again, to support them as well. And within our tribe, we also created a family group decision-making process so that they could have supports, just like exactly what you're talking about, outside of the judicial system, because there's a lot of stigma around that, right? If they come to court and they have to have all these things, sometimes they don't want to get involved, or even with social services, that could be even worse. And so our education department is actually where that process is located, so that they could refer themselves to it, or they could have other people refer them to a family group decision-making process, where then they meet together as a family to kind of say, how can we support one another and get through these types of things? So, it really is having those conversations on the front end, because you can't really do it in the middle or at the end, because by then it's kind of already too late, or there's so many issues that it's just not going to be as effective. So that's what I recommend, is when you're working with the youth, you automatically think, I'm working with the whole family. And that's challenging. I think a lot of times it's more challenging to work with juveniles than it is just to work with an adult, because you do have that family component that you're also having to consider. But it's so worth it. It's so worth it.
Our next question, our last question is Emily says, I'm interested in advice for how to begin developing relationships before we need them, opportunities to start building collaborative relationships. For
I could
context, she says, we're a restorative justice nonprofit in Maine. We facilitate restorative justice processes primarily with youth through referrals.
if you're specifically talking about how, to form those relationships with tribal nations or with Native organizations, that kind of thing, like find out, go to the important events, right? Like every year, South Dakota hosts the Lakota Nation Invitational, which is a big basketball tournament where several tribal nations come from all over, not just South Dakota. There's a number of other things. It's a huge event. So our tribal committee was intentional about always being at that event and having a booth and networking. And so like, that alone, of the amount of like the people we met, the getting the word out to youth and families about what we were trying to do was huge. So I mean, and I guess I don't know about DC, but I know there's lots of like urban Native centers across the country that are always hosting Indigenous events and organizations, and showing up and showing your support is a good way to build those relationships.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I was going to say something similar too. And every tribe is different, but like for my tribe specifically, they would always invite people to come to our ceremonies that were open to the public. So we have bear dance, we have sun dance, we have powwows, things like that. And that shows that you're kind of interested in learning about the culture, which is really important. And I know the publication that is tied to this mentions that, as well as learning the culture and the history of the tribe. But also what we would do is have people that would reach out to us, and as the judge, I would get emails from different agencies. And then I would bring it up to our tribal council and say, hey, here's an agency that I think might be good for us to work with or collaborate with. Could we invite them to a director meeting? So it wasn't a tribal council meeting, but a director meeting where all the departments within the tribe meet every month. And we have different agenda items. And that agency would be able to come and present what it is they do, how they can offer services, what kind of resources they have available. And then that would start some of those relationships, because then other departments would say, hey, we could work with you in this capacity, or we could collaborate in this way. And we're grateful that you reached out to us, and, that we're able to have these conversations. And another reason why too is a lot of the states get money that have used data from the tribes to be able to get that funding for those resources and programs. And so they really should be working with the tribes in that way of providing whatever service or resource it is that, they have funding for. And so reaching out and saying, hey, we have something that we can provide to you, and this is how it's going to, assist you, is really good, because the tribes want to know that is, what are we getting out of it? And not just what are we giving to you. But that also is, additional information that is good, especially if tribes are looking at also getting other funding, because that's a lot of the grants require collaboration with other agencies and departments or whatever. And so that's a great way to say, hey, we're partnering with this agency or nonprofit to provide these services to our youth, and this is what it's going to do. And I know that a lot of tribes have to get evaluations that they don't normally, get with in-house, or maybe their health clinics aren't able to do. So that could be something that you guys work with facilitating as well. The DOC does a lot of those kind of in-depth evaluations that can determine if there's diagnoses or anything like that. So those are other areas where you can look at and say, hey, we can also provide access to this by collaborating, or by being a bridge to be able to get these services that the tribe might not have access to otherwise, or that may cost a lot of money to get, to have to hire, a private psychiatrist or something like that. So just some thoughts.
And I would add to what Chantel was saying, is invite them also to your events that you might have. I was thinking of our here where I live, our social service, the county social service agency, they have like countywide wellness events. They invite I don't know, different service providers, or they have luncheon to just sort of introduce all of the services. And so I know they make a point of doing outreach to the local nations to include them and to ask, hey, do you want to set up a booth? Do you have, do you, or do you just want to come and join us or whatever? And so there's always opportunities to do that outreach and build those relationships. So, well, we've come to the end of our time together, and so I just want to say there's going to be a link to Justice Link for those of you who are not a part of Justice Link. Please check it out. Look at our little community that we have here, Annie E. Casey Foundation. I've put in the chat the website for the association and for how you can access the collaboration guide, which is free to download. And I also just want to say mazigadats, or a heartfelt thank you to Chantel and Annie and Tamera for being a panelist today and sharing their experience and their insight into how we can best work together to serve Native youth. And to all of you who came, thank you for joining us today. And we hope we were able to answer your questions and encourage you and inspire you to partner with Native nations. So until we meet again, thank you, everyone. We appreciate you, and take care.